The so-called saddle fitting experts cannot detect this error because they do not use any three-dimensional measurements to be able to determine the shape of the saddle relative to the shape of the horse. "We got measurements," they say. Little cardboard templates, plus or minus 3 degrees, are not measurements, because there is no way to even determine the angle on the saddle. It's just a hang tag, and it's a wild guess at that. To determine the fit, you need 3 dimensions, and there have been no 3-dimensional saddle measurement instruments until now. So everyone tries every possible 1-dimensional tracing idea and calls it measurement. 1-dimensional tracing is not 3-dimensional measurement. Narrow, medium, and wide is all fine and dandy, but what about the rock of the saddle? No one even measures the curve of the back, and that actually determines the most important factor if the saddle actually bridges, and that's not even on the radar screen. To build a 3-dimensional template, what is required is real no-nonsense pattern making, as is used in the manufacturing of cars, boats, airplanes, and even saddles for the United States Cavalry. This drawing is required to figure out the shape of the parts to be able to create the 3-dimensional pattern. Then you actually need to construct 2 patterns. The first is to fit the horse to be sure that the measurements and the drawing are accurate in the first place. Then you can make the second pattern, and by double-checking the second pattern against the first pattern for accuracy, you are then in a position to fit the template to the saddle. No one actually makes these patterns, including the saddle makers, because it requires skill and it is time-consuming. It took me over 5 hours to do this template for illustration, and I used to build boats when I was young. So why are we making tracings? And then there's another problem. What about gravity? This is a pattern of the horse's back with no load. How can you use this pattern to figure out the horse with the rider? Even worse, once the rider mounts, they cannot see, feel, or even measure under the saddle. Catch-22. The customer cannot really determine the fit of the saddle, even if they do try. From your lips to God's ears, the Horse.com website has a section called Common Sense Saddle Fitting that says it all. And I quote, "Keep in mind there is no standardization in the industry, as tree sizing measurements differ between tree makers, saddle makers, and saddle styles." Well, there are no standards. No problem. I would say that is an opportunity to create the standard and knock it right out of the park.